seated now and say a few words. This portion this week we started the book of Leviticus, and this is the second reading, and it's a portion about animal sacrifice, right? Ultimately, a whole lot of different sacrifices, but there's a whole lot of discussion about guilt offerings and meal offerings and all those kinds of things. And it is in many ways a portion which is quite remote from us and difficult to engage with, and also troubling, because for those of us who care about animals, who care about other creatures, here are animals being used ostensibly as a means of atonement, for example, for a guilt offering, and animals actually lose their lives, and the details are quite gory. There's no other way to say it than gory details, with the blood being sprinkled and all kinds of, turtle doves neck being twisted, and it's not very nice. And I always struggle with this. For some reason, I've often been I often land up getting to sermonize on this parasha, and I always have difficulty with it. And I often feel that the way to react to it is actually in protest, right? It's not to actually try and find some deeper meaning in the sacrifices. There was a whole sacrificial idea in Judaism, we know this, and there were different forms of offerings, and one can go into all those kinds of points. But actually, I think a lot of it is quite unacceptable to many modern people. And in a way, it represents something that we actually dislike, right? Or many people dislike, or many people have a problem with, and actually invites us to protest against us. And I think this is not a bad thing necessarily. Some of Jewish texts actually invite us to challenge those texts. Some of Jewish texts invite us to ask questions about those texts, and that we don't actually necessarily have to accept everything that is said therein. I know this is not something that you may hear from an Orthodox rabbi, but nevertheless, it's something that I think actually sometimes they're there to challenge us, to challenge our morals, and to say to us, if you really believe in certain forms of morality, you're going to protest against what's here. And that actually is not something un-Jewish. It's very much Jewish, right? It's very much Abraham, right? Challenging God when God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, well, you can't destroy, you can't not distinguish the innocent from the guilty. It's the most basic principle of morality, and I protest. And God listens, right? And similarly, we are enjoined to protest at times, to stand up, even here, against what's seemingly coming from God's command. But actually, we're not meant to be, unthinking individuals and automatons. We're meant to engage with God's command, understanding that command, perhaps understanding whether it was actually relative to a certain time, and understanding that there were sacrifices at that time, that religion wouldn't have been understood fully, that Judaism advanced, for instance, on other religions on other forms of practice by rejecting human sacrifice, but it struggled to reject animal sacrifice. And that that Judaism paves the way in its own texts to a different ethic towards the most vulnerable, and animals as well, right? And a different ethic, which is an ethic of care and concern and respect. And I did actually talk about this. Some of you may have seen, I was on the program Derech Eretz. We can maybe share with Temple Israel, which had a special program it's on 11 o'clock on a Sunday. And they featured specifically issues around animals. And they featured me discussing some of my work around animals and why I do it and why I think it's linked to Judaism. And they also featured someone else from the Orthodox community who saved a zebra who was going to be shot. And it's a very interesting insert, and can maybe share. I was just sent the link. It's on YouTube. We can perhaps share with the Temple Israel community. I'll send it perhaps after Shabbat to Jacob or Riva, and can be shared. And you can kind of hear a bit about some of that work, and also some more of the detail of the ethics. But I think that idea of protest, of standing up against things that one does think are unconscionable or not acceptable, is rooted in our tradition and is a vital and important thing. And it's often not to one's benefit, but often necessary to do if you're going to retain a sense of yourself and your own identity. And that idea is, of course, we just read in Purim, we had a terrible command, right? Actually, it's interesting, this parasha begins with the word Tzav, which actually means a command. And the whole of the story of Purim is actually about commands and actually about really problematic commands, right? I mean, we see the king handing over his authority to make law and allowing a law to be enacted that said men, women, and children were to be slaughtered, right? That was the command, that was the law. Right, and we see a little detail in the Megillah, which says to us, and the city of Shushan was perplexed, right? Because laws like that are perplexing. I mean, how do you follow a law which tells you to go and kill men, women, and children? Right? Can that even be a law? Right? It's a major question in legal theory, but it's you know, what does one do in the face of that? And it showed that even ordinary people were troubled by that. Would they have enacted it? Well, there's always people who are willing to do that. We know there was some anti-Semitic components. But actually what has to happen is there has to be a protest. Mordechai, in a way, protests already against Haman's authority by refusing to bow down to him. And of course, there's also skillful politics that is engaged here, right? That actually protest in the streets may not work. So they had to work with Esther, who was an insider, to try and change, and Esther works very skillfully to have two feasts and eventually changes the whole decree. But even then it's very odd because the king can't reverse his decree, so he gives her a decree that Jews can defend themselves, and it leads to a lot of bloodshed, right? So we have commands, unjust commands, and the need to work around that, to find ways to address that. And ultimately, unfortunately, that often does lead to bloodshed. Human Rights Day, and I think I forgot to have that as the beginning, but we can do it as the end, Jacob, the clip. Human Rights Day, of course, was very much about protest against unjust laws, right? You read a little bit about the history of South Africa, and you are struck by the terrible injustice of our past and our history. You learn about people who were living their own lives, and we don't need to idealize the communities. I'm sure there were tensions in all communities, okay? But were living their lives and forced to go into the mines in the late 1800s because they wanted labor force. So what did people do? People were living in rural communities. They don't want to go work in mines, right? But they were forced to by a hut tax, right? Imposed on people to actually have to pay a tax, which they couldn't afford without working. Right, and that led to so many problems, even we face today, with the dissolution of many close-knit African traditional family structures. And we then have, we can't go through the whole history of South Africa, the 1948 election, although in a sense, perhaps it was also a failure on the part of the more moderate party, Jan Smuts's party, to see the threat to it was obviously mostly only a white electorate, but the threat that was posed by the Nationalist Party, but the Nationalist Party comes to power and implements the system of apartheid and all the kinds of different laws, prohibiting marriages, prohibiting people sitting on the same benches, even on toilets, going to the same toilets, all these kinds of things, and, you know, harming the education of Black people. And of course, one of the most oppressive elements was the imposition of the pass law, of not being able to move freely around the country. Someone whose birthright it is, but having to go around with a pass, right, to move between different places, Black people being told that you only can stay in certain places, and if you want to come into so-called white areas, you need a pass to be able to work. And that was, of course, enforced. I even remember it in the 80s. You know, I was, you know, growing up then, but I remember the police used to go on out and ask people for their passes in the street. It was terrible. And there was a protest initially, peaceful protest. People said, we can't abide by this. We can't abide by this lack of freedom of movement, this almost disenfranchisement, this sense of dispossession of our own land, our freedom of movement around our land. And there was a protest in Sharpeville, and of course the government didn't like it, and the police fired on peaceful protesters. 69 people were killed, and I think around 180 were injured in that event, which then shock waves across the world. It led to a lot of challenges to apartheid South Africa, started leading to international pressure. But of course, it took a long time before South Africa was going to change still. Actually, the 60s were a much more repressive time. South African economy was doing well. And gradually, the 70s started really the real resistance with the workers in 1973, and then the high school students in 1976 refusing to be taught in Afrikaans in the Soweto uprising. So, and we see that continue through the 80s, leading us, to really a recognition of the unsustainability of the future of South Africa without a change in the regime, and a decision to move towards a negotiated settlement and a Bill of Rights, which would protect the rights of everybody in the country to protest against injustice, right? Justice Albie Sachs said once, it used to be the case that you could have law and judges couldn't do anything about it if it was enacted by Parliament. It would simply be an unjust law, and you had to follow it. Okay, it wasn't as simple as that. Many judges did try resist a little bit, but no longer, he said, in South Africa should we have unjust laws. If the laws are blatantly unjust, we should be able to strike them down because they are inconsistent with human rights, Bill of Rights, the rights that protect our most basic interests, our most vulnerable in society, our ability to be free. We have those, what we call civil rights, to be free, to protest, to talk, to vote, to participate in the community. We call those political rights. And to eat, what we call socio-economic rights, right? Rights that protect our ability to have the basic necessities of life, such as housing and food and healthcare, and also to be able to develop our talents, the right to education, and obviously other rights like the right to due process and fair trials and other matters. Okay, so that's what Human Rights Day enshrines, and that's why it's you can say in French, quel dommage, how what a pity it is that our government has just recently taken such a stance in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, to stand on the fence on a state of neutrality in the face of serious crimes that are being committed in relation to human rights. And let us be clear, there is no justification or lawful justification in international law for the invasion of Ukraine. Whatever justifications have been suggested are not lawful, and there was no need for an armed conflict. Nor is there any justification, once you have an armed conflict, for bombing civilian buildings. One of the most central principles of international law, right, which has been enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and many other central principles, is that you have to distinguish between civilians and combatants. And it can be difficult sometimes. We know the discussions in relation to Israel, where combatants, militants often are within civilian areas, and it becomes very difficult. But this isn't the case in Russia. These are civilian buildings being bombed with no military installation, with no military targets at all. Right? So there's no justification for doing that. And that is utterly outrageous in terms of every principle of international law, of any principle of humanity. And it needs to be called out by every country that is decent to say that is absolutely unacceptable and absolutely wrong, right? And we need to be very clear about that. We have obligations in our own country to that. Every country has a duty to call out those kinds of aspects. We see, of course, that protest I was talking about. People, some very brave people, even in Russia, have attempted to protest, and they get arrested virtually immediately. It's become a police state. But we also saw how a woman, an editor on Russian television, state television, went and held up a sign to try and tell the people you're being lied to, right, on the television. Okay, quite an incredible act, a brave act, an act that we have to have great admiration for, because would we do such a thing knowing the potential consequences for ourselves? And so they're good people on all sides. We have to remember there may well be ordinary Russian soldiers even who don't want to be part of this conflict, right? Remember, this is very much a
Is David frozen, or is it just me?
David is frozen. David is frozen. I hope he unfreezes because he speaks brilliantly.
Absolutely, Hilda, I do agree with you.
Oh, I wish I could be a student in his classes. It's so stimulating.
Yes.
It seems like my internet connection is also bad.
Is that John?
Yes, my connection is also very bad.
hello, everyone.
David, have we lost you, or can you hear us?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but
yes,
we lost
now.
you, and we don't want to miss a word. Everyone's saying they're hanging on to every word. So go back 2 sentences, please.
No, that's fine. I don't understand what happened. It cut out suddenly. It's very strange. But anyhow, yeah, I was just saying, where was I? I mean, I talked about the civilian distinction that we cannot, and the protest, and also that actually we can't see this as a war by Russian people really against Ukrainians. This is a war by an evil leadership in many ways. And it's something that we should be calling out and clearly indicating against injustice. And there is no neutrality in the face of blatant evil and blatant violations of human rights. In fact, our country and the current ANC, right, the ruling party, said that in the face of apartheid, right? This is not an internal affairs matter. This is a matter that has to shock the conscience of humankind, and we have to engage with it clearly and openly. So I think we learn 2 things from these aspects, right? The one is, yes, when in the face of injustice, we have to protest, we have to stand up, we have to say no, right? Even in the face of high-level commands. Like I said, our parasha suggests it's coming even from God, and even there, God's testing our moral conscience. Do we agree? Don't we agree? Right? And in relation to God, we hope we can have a dialogue, a relationship, right? And God will understand our conscience actually is the God of all creatures, and will have compassion as well when we act out of compassion. But we need to sometimes take risks and actually challenge authority when it's actually not convenient to us and may actually cause us sort of, harm even, and actually stand up against injustice and evil, and stand up for what Human Rights Day and our Torah tell us very much about: protecting the dignity of people and vulnerable creatures and all sentient creatures, right? And that dignity comes out in fundamental rights, because if we protect dignity, we want to ensure that you have the freedom to live the life that you want. We want to ensure you can participate in your community, right? And we want to ensure that you have the basic necessities of life to ensure you can live a life that you care about and that is a meaningful and quality of life to you. So Human Rights Day is a fundamental day. It's a very important day for us to think about where we are, what it requires of us, and how we have to rededicate ourselves, right? Our country is falling, not just in the international affairs as well, we should say, right? It's not just in making statements. It's failing the people, right? At Baragwanath Hospital last week, doctors and nurses were buying lunch for patients. How did we arrive at that point where people are starving in hospital? Okay, so there is a blatant failure, and that has to be remedied. And it has to be remedied as a matter of urgency. That is affecting all South Africans, but it's also affecting South Africans disproportionately and affects the poorest in the worst way, right? And I've had recent experience of someone close to me, poor community, who lost her life from neglect for her and suffered a really harsh end. That is unacceptable. That's not what our Constitution promises. And it's time we started fixing it at all levels of society, civil society. I know Temple Israel is committed to these kind of things. And not only at civil society, in politics, politicians should no longer tolerate ridiculous things in the name of corrupt authorities, right? And judges need to be stronger, right, on these matters and really reject wherever government fails to deliver on fundamental rights and ensure effective remedies for people whose rights are not realized. So we have a lot to do. We have a historical memory, which is important on the 21st of March. We have a historical memory as Jews, as South Africans, and let it not disable us, but let us make us, in whatever way we can, and think about practically the way you can, right? In whatever work you do, in little ways, in bigger ways, to try and make a difference, to protect, defend human rights and all those who are vulnerable, both human and non-human. Okay, thank you very much for that sermon, for the listening to the sermon, not for the sermon. And let us continue with Aleinu. Riva, do you want to say a few comments and then we can end with Adon Olam?
Yes. First of all, David, Professor, my David, your drosha, and Hilda commented while you were frozen for a few minutes, how insightful and how excellent it was, bringing to the fore how it is so important for all of us to raise our voice, even at a cost to ourselves, against injustice. And particularly with our past in this country, we were so fortunate through the spirituality of a man like Mandela and others that we did not experience the full horror of a full-blown war. And yet what we did experience to many were extremely horrific, loss of life and painful. And I'll just keep this short, David. I think it's so important when Jacob shows just a few minutes of people protesting against evil, what that protest cost lives that day, as you said, at Sharpeville. And that the world must stand up and protest and fight this evil dictator, this mad person, who really, it's not right that we keep quiet and governments keep quiet. So with your magnificent drosha in mind, thank you once again for being part of Temple Israel and Temple Israel Heritage Center. And we follow in your footsteps as a professor of constitutional law, that God guides us in our deliberations to do the right thing, to stand up and be counted when it's necessary. So thank you very much. And the only other...
Shabbat shalom to everyone. Shabbat shalom, Brian.
Brian?
Can't hear you, Brian.
He'll unmute.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He's muted.
Good to see you, Brian.
Shabbat shalom.
Great.
And there was John.
John, Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom,
Riva.
David. Shabbat shalom, Riva. Shabbat shalom, Hilda, Brian, Tarai, and everybody else.
Thank
Shabbat shalom,
you.
John.
Shabbat shalom.
And Torai, Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you, Rabbi David. Happy Shabbos,
David,
everyone.
like it or not, you're a rabbi.
Yeah, you're dating me, Torai, but thank you very much, and I hope you're well. And Shabbat
Yes.
shalom, Hilda.
Shabbat shalom to you and everybody. And thank you so much. Really was a beautiful service. Thank you.
so
Now
much,
my
Hilda.
telephone is ringing. I'm going to have to say goodbye in a moment.
Please
Thank
do.
you.
But Hilda, do
Yes.
join us tomorrow.
I hope
Jake?
I can, because there's
Shabbat
David,
shalom,
I'm gonna encourage-
Lawrence.
Yeah,
I
Lauren.
may not be able
Thank you
to.
very much, David. I was going to play with words, but there's no time now. about being ordained. I think your talk was extraordinary. So
Just say, Lawrence.
Thank you,
Wow,
Lawrence.
what
Brilliant. Very, very good.
I really enjoyed your words.
Thank you
And
so much. Much
David, now
appreciated.
just tell everyone before they disappear that we need each and every one of you with us tomorrow morning, because you're all going to have a chance of actually reading from Esther's Megillah. So we need as many as possible with us tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you, Reva. Shabbat Shalom, Jacob and Sarona.
David, it's wonderful to have the service with you.
Thank you, and lovely to hear. I can't see you, but good to good. Thank you, Jacob, for the assistance as well, as always.
We got no camera. My camera is gone.
Your camera, I can see it's great, but I know you there. I can hear you both, so that's fantastic. And there's someone called Zoom user. I don't know who that is, but Zoom
Yes,
user.
who's the Zoom user?
Shabbat Shalom.
Whoever Zoom user is.
Someone is muted
Elaine.
over the use of Zoom.
Hang on,
Elaine.
let's see. Who's
Elaine.
it?
Elaine.
Elaine. Oh, I was worried about you the whole evening. And I said,
didn't
I'm not
start
going to, I know you're in Cape Town, but bang, you were with us. You were
I was
my
with
Zoom
you.
user.
Yes, okay. I enjoyed the service. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Elaine.
David, Professor David, Rabbi David, thank you. Reva, Marion, thank you all for what you do. Jacob, it's wonderful. That was a wonderful, wonderful human rights drosha. I really enjoyed it. And it's one that everybody should hear every month, be reminded. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you,
I'm
Elaine.
sure
I really
we'll-
appreciate it.
David,
And
I'm
so
sure with Jacob's skills, I know most of my brochures are recorded and kept, but perhaps we can keep yours tonight and we can send it out on email to
clip it
friends
out.
and
Yeah,
family.
I have
Yeah.
to edit it somehow.
Fantastic.
And will you send the link for
The animal thing, I'll send that after
that
Shabbat.
animal thing? What's it called again? The spirits.
The Derech Eretz, yeah. I'll send
Derech
it to
Eretz, yes.
Jacob
Okay,
or-
thank you.
or Reba for
Thank
sharing.
you very much.
excellent.
I must
That
go.
was
The phone
ex-
stopped ringing, but I must go anyway.
Yeah, I
Shabbat
also have to
shalom.
go.
See you
So
tomorrow.
Shabbat
Shabbat
Shalom,
Shalom.
everyone.
David, I'll be
Bye.
phoning you. Bye. Shabbat shalom. Thank you, Jacob.
Shabbat
Thank you,
shalom,
Marion.
everybody.
Jacob and Sarona, Rivkala.
Yes, my
Everybody.
darling cousin.
Okay. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.